books were aimed at children and young people, mainly. So this one is called The Story of Our Canals, which I thought was a nice one to do on a summer's day. And I hope you like my lovely sunflower tablecloth with the little ladybird on the leaf. So let's have a look inside. So this Ladybird book is from 1975, and it's a Ladybird Achievements book, series 601. So they all had different series, and on the left hand side shows you how a canal lock works, and it says here, from the opening of the Bridgewater Canal in 1761 until well into the 19th century, the canal system in Great Britain grew at a tremendous pace. At its height, there were over 6,000 miles of navigable rivers and canals, covering the length and breadth of the country, supplying the vital link between mines, farms, factories and ports. The story of how this was achieved, of the colourful characters who dug the canals and operated them, is here depicted in words and pictures in all its fascinating detail. So there's an index on the left hand side. So here's the introduction. On the right hand side, it's typical of these Ladybird books to have an illustration, and on the left hand side to have the text. So let's read this. Early in the 18th century, Britain was largely agricultural, but workers were beginning to move away from the land to the new textile and iron smelting industries. Steam was replacing wind and water as a source of power, and coal was therefore needed in large quantities. The new industries wanted more and more rights to buy land and obtain water. The Act also protected the interests of those who might lose by the construction of the canal. There was always opposition, and this is one of the reasons why an Act was necessary. Landowners affected were compensated, and so were millers and factory owners who feared a loss of water. Since canals were local projects, consisted of running sand. Lifts and inclined planes. So, let me turn this page around. So this is called the Foxton Incline. That's remarkable. You can see the barge actually in this kind of contraption taking it uphill. The engineers found other ways of moving boats up and down hills, ways which were quicker, less expensive than logs, and less extravagant in the use of water. Higher and lower canal levels might be connected by steeply sloping railways. On the Bute Canal in Cornwall, there were 6 of these inclined planes, and the tugboats used were fitted with 4 iron wheels, which ran up and down the rails on the incline. At Foxton, on the Grand Union Canal, colossal tanks called caissons, capable of holding a pair of narrow boats, were pulled sideways up and down by wire ropes, powered by steam winding gear. At the lower end, the caissons were immersed in the canal basin to allow boats to enter or leave through lift-up gates set in the ends of the tanks. The incline took 12 minutes to raise or lower boats, compared with over an hour by way of existing narrow staircase locks. The expected additional traffic did not materialise, and the incline was used only for about 10 years. There were also vertical lifts with 2 caissons suspended by wires from wheels. Water was added to the uppermost tank, so that when it began to descend, its weight raised the lower tank. But the planes and lifts have now all ceased to operate, except for the immense Anderton lift in Cheshire, which transfers boats between the Trent and Mersey Canal and the River Weaver. It is electrically operated and can raise or lower boats over 50 feet in 5 minutes. Now, I actually don't know whether that still exists. I wonder if anybody knows. Canal Tunnels. Several canal tunnels are less than 100 yards long, but the longest, the Standedge on the Huddersfield Narrow Canal, is over 3 miles long. The first mainline canal tunnel in England was the Hardcastle on the Trent and Mersey Canal. It was 2,897 yards long and took 11 years to dig out. It was only 9 feet wide and did not have a towpath. Its narrowness caused such delays that a second tunnel was built alongside. Both tunnels were used for 90 years, one for northbound boats and the other for southbound traffic. It was cheaper to build a narrow tunnel with no towpath. In the days of horse-drawn boats, the children or the women would lead the horse over the hill while a boat was legged or shafted through the tunnel. Legging, an exhausting task, was performed by 2 men who lay on their backs, one each side at the fore end of the boat. You can see them here. And pushed against the tunnel walls with their feet. If the tunnel was wide and they could not reach the side walls, legging boards or wings, which projected over the side of the boat, were fitted again at the fore end, and the men lay on these. You can see them laying on those boards there. In low tunnels, one man could leg an empty boat by lying on the cabin top and pressing against the roof with his feet. Shafting involved pushing with a long pole against the top or sides of the tunnel while walking from forward to aft along the length of the boat. Chains were fastened along the walls of some side of the canal to the other. A towing horse could use a bridge like this without being unhitched from the boat. A split or divided bridge comprised timber decking on iron brackets, projecting half across the canal from each side, but not quite meeting in the middle. When a horse-drawn boat approached the bridge, the horse was slowed up and the tow line dropped through the slit between the two parts his tow line to let the other horse past. It was generally understood that loaded boats were given right of way over unloaded craft. However, horses needed food and rest, and many horse-drawn boats were replaced by craft equipped with steam-driven engines. These steamers were not very successful, since the engine and boiler took up much valuable cargo space and required constant attention to keep up the head of steam. Eventually, the steam engine was replaced by a diesel unit, which took up less space and would run for many years without much trouble. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, but I will continue with the rest of this book on canals in another video. This has been